Well, hello. In this podcast, I'm going to do something slightly different to what I've been doing before. So, if you were hoping for a story about wildlife photography, I apologize because this is about something different. So, I thought in this particular podcast, I'd just talk a little bit about what it was like to go down in a small submarine and go down to the wreck of the Titanic. Now, if you don't know, the Titanic is about 2.5 miles deep underwater, so that's quite a long distance, obviously, to go down in a submarine. Now, I went in the sub in 2001, in July 2001, so in fact, almost exactly 20 years ago from when I'm recording this. And I thought I'd just share some of what it was like, just sort of highlights, I guess, because you can imagine there was quite a bit to it. So basically, I met a Russian ship, the Academic Keldysh, which was built by the Soviets, the Soviet era, with the two Mir submarines. And the ship and the Mirs were designed by one of the guys who's actually on the crew. And I believe the subs were built in Finland. And at the time, there were only 5 manned submersibles, if you like, that were capable of diving down to the Titanic. So at the time, there were the two Mirs, the two Russian submarines. There was Alvin, which operates out of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Massachusetts. So that was the submarine that Bob Ballard was using when he discovered the wreck back in the I think it was late 80s now. A bit of just trying to think back to when that was. There was a French submersible called the Nautil, which had been doing a lot of the salvage work. So there was a salvage agreement, and whereby people operating the Nautil could go down to the bottom of the North Atlantic and recover items from the wreck of the Titanic. So there had been, I think it was about 5,000 items. So an awful lot of things had been recovered from the wreck by the time I went down. And then the final submarine was a Japanese submarine. Now, so we met the Keldysh, and the thing about the Keldysh as well, having been designed as a scientific research vessel in the Soviet era, in many cases when it went into port, because of it being Soviet, the crew weren't allowed on shore. So it meant that it was actually reasonably well appointed for a research ship. So it had a really nice meeting room that we used to use a lot for briefings and looking at high definition video that had been shot by one of the submarines while we were there. They had a nice volleyball court on the kind of deck towards the back where we would go and watch the submarines being launched. So it was well appointed. And then for those of us who were going, so there was myself, there was a guy called Lyle, a Texan guy, and then 2 couples. So the way the submarines are set up, Mir 1 and Mir 2, they are both 3-person subs. So the pilot will be, I was going to say sitting, but they're not. They're kind of more on their knees in the middle of the submarine in front of a larger porthole, which is in the middle, sort of facing forward and down. And then passengers are on short benches either side. So I'm not the tallest person you're going to meet. So I'm about 5'7", about 1.7 meters, and I couldn't lie straight out on the bench because inside the sub you've got all sorts of other gear. So there's radio equipment there, so we could stay in contact with the surface. Obviously, there was sonar equipment, so we could see what was around us, and various other things. So we had air purification systems in there. We had emergency equipment. The emergency gear to get us up was actually under a panel in the center of the submarine. So in front of the pilot, there was a control panel there with joysticks, because the way the Mirs steered, they had 2 small propellers on either side, about halfway along the side of the sub, and those could rotate up and down. And then at the back, there was a large propeller which could steer from side to side. So between them, we had 3-dimensional movement, which obviously is useful in a submarine. So the main controls were in the center, and that was obviously where the pilot was. But underneath that, if you lifted that panel up, there was all of the emergency gear, and that would jettison these I think they were lead weights. So another unusual thing about the MERS, the other submarines that I've mentioned, what they would do, they would use ballast obviously to get them down, but once they were on this as far down as they wanted to go and they wanted to come back up, they would actually jettison these I think they're nickel pellets, but anyway, it's basically they would drop weights, so jettison weights out of the submarine, and the submarine would go up. The MERS didn't do that, and I kind of like that actually, because it just seems such a waste of all of this material. So what the MERS would do to become positively buoyant so that they began to float was to pump out ballast tanks. So now at that depth, I think the pressure was 5,000 pounds per square inch, but I might have got that wrong. I mean, it's a huge pressure, and you can't go outside at that depth. You'd be crushed in a moment. You just wouldn't know. And also, the danger to us was if the pressure sphere we were in, so it's a circular pressure sphere of about 3 meters at sea level, stayed at sea level, so we didn't have to depressurize. And the rest of the sub was kind of built around it with all the motors and the maneuvering gear and all the rest of it. If that got punctured at that depth, the whole thing would have just imploded. There'd been an explosion and an implosion, and we would have been dead before we knew there was even a problem. So it was that sort of a situation down there. So just imagine the pressure that those pumps are having to push against to pump water out to make the sub positively buoyant and then go back up. So that was the standard way of getting up. But what we could do, and this was the emergency controls, we could drop weight ballast. So that was one option. There was a huge battery pack underneath the submarine as well, which gave us our power, and that could be jettisoned. The propellers on either side could also be jettisoned. So if we were trapped, if we got caught up in something down there, we could actually just jettison those external propellers so that we could then float free. So that was kind of the setup there. Now, the way it worked, we met the ship in St. John's in Newfoundland, and then headed off because it was about a day and a half's travel to get to the wreck site, where we dropped sonar buoys so that we could, because we had the GPS location, and then we would drop in sonar buoys down to help us locate and navigate on the ocean floor there. And what they did while we were once we'd got to the site, they'd actually put us in the submarines while we were still on deck. So the submarines are on the port side of the ship, and they are under these covers which kind of hinge up. And so it's like a garage thing over the sub, but it hinges up towards the center of the ship, exposing the submarine. And then the submarine is lifted up by a crane, swung overboard, and then put into the ocean. And there's a smaller boat that's also deployed, and that is used, that attaches a line to the sub, tows it away from the Keldysh, and then disconnects from the submarine, and then that's where the submarine will go down. So obviously all of that happens. Now, what they did with us, they got us to climb inside the submarines, and we closed the hatch. So you enter the MERS from the top. So that means you climb a ladder which goes over the front of the submarine. You kind of sit up there, take your shoes off before you get inside, and then you climb down an internal ladder to go inside the sub. They close the hatch. That internal ladder then swings up, so it's kind of across the hatch and like on the above you, and then you're inside. And the purpose of that was to take us through some of the drill, what to do if something went wrong, and we went through all the emergency procedures. But also, I think it was just to make sure nobody freaked out, because if you are claustrophobic, it's quite a small environment to be in, and obviously it's much better to have a kind of a freaking out situation when you're sat on the deck, rather than on the bottom of the ocean, where you're, with the normal ascent, 2.5 hours away from getting back to the surface. So that was essentially the drill. And as I've said, once we had launched, it took us 2.5 hours. So the sub descends at about 1 mile an hour. So it's quite gentle. So the sub is gradually adjusting to the pressure all the way down. And so 2.5 hours down, we actually were on the bottom of the ocean, going around the Titanic for about 6 hours, and then another 2.5 hours going back up. So we were out early in the day. So MER 1 launched first, and we were out, I think it was about 8:30, 9ish, something like that, but certainly no later than 9. And So we got on board, locked everything up, swung off, and we were sort of dropped into the ocean, towed out away from the Keldysh, disconnected from the towboat, and then we began to submerge once everyone was happy that everything was working. And that was then a gentle 2.5 hour descent. So what happens is, first of all, that you lose the light pretty early on. I do have a notebook that I was keeping, but unfortunately it's not handy, of course. And you lose the light after about 100 to between 100 and 300 meters. It gets the light disappears very rapidly. So once you get below about 300 meters below the surface, you are, or 300 feet, seems roughly it's good enough. So you're in darkness then, and you're in total darkness for most of the dive. Now the MERS themselves have internal lights, and then they also have external lights. So there are external lights which are on boom arms that can kind of swing out in front of the sub, so they get really good illumination. So that you may have already seen these submarines and not realized it, because if you've watched the James Cameron movie Titanic, the one with Kate Winslet in it and what's his name, DiCaprio, that ship is the Academic Keldysh. Now the only thing that isn't right about it is the helicopter deck. It doesn't actually have a helicopter deck. That was just put on. That was a cardboard thing, I think, put on for the movie. But that ship and those two submarines that they show at the beginning, where they go down, those are the MERS. And Anatoly, in fact, who's the guy who designed the MERS, it features in the movie. He's the one who you see him inside one of the submarines. And then when they open I don't know if you remember the scene where they open the safe and they find it's empty. He's the guy who says, "Oh, it's empty," or something along those lines in his Russian accent. But Anatoly was our pilot in MER 1. So we went down, and in fact, you're talking on the way down. So we're just looking outside, and there's not a lot to see, but occasionally we'd see these animals that were bioluminescing, and that the motion of us going down through the ocean, I believe, was causing them to bioluminesce. And it was kind of weird because they were just a sort of luminescent shape out there in the water, in the darkness. But there was no way of sighting them because we didn't know how far away they were. So there was no way of knowing exactly how big they were. On our voyage, we also had some research guys and a guy from NOAA, which is like the Australian NASA, but for the oceans. And the two research guys were doing some research with high definition video that they were experimenting with this back in 2001. So these days, I guess it'd be pretty ordinary video. And but they were very interested in what we could see. So I think at least one was a marine biologist. So I just jotted down some observations while we were on our way down. And Anatoly turned the lights out, all of the lights except some sort of red emergency lighting that stayed on inside, so that we could have a clearer look of what was outside the submarine. So we did that on the journey down. And some conversation with the surface while we were on our way down. And then as we started getting closer to the bottom, we began to pick up the bottom on our sonar. And so I remember looking out of my porthole. So on the way down, I think on the way down, I was actually on the starboard side. And I was looking out, and it was all dark below me. And then all of a sudden, this very pale, beigey kind of surface appeared below us, and that was the ocean floor, which looks like a very soft sort of mud dust. It had some dust in it, or it wouldn't be dust in the ocean, obviously, but there's sediment there that does come up that you disturb. But the floor basically appeared below us, and then we kind of got down there onto that level. And what happens down there is that there's stuff in the water, and particularly we saw it when we were down and we'd stopped moving in a kind of vertically, and it was a little bit like a fine snow, but it obviously wasn't snow. What it was just organic material that was gradually drifting down. So things were dying and decaying in the higher levels of the water, and this stuff was gradually drifting down and would eventually land on the bottom of the ocean. And chatting to the guys in the ship afterwards, I learned that there seems to be a sort of 4 or 5 day cycle where you get sort of a heavy drop of it, and then it eases out until you get very little, and then it sort of picks up again. So we were partway through that cycle when we were down there. So anyway, there you go. We're sort of down in the submarine and on the bottom of the North Atlantic, and we had sonar contact. We could see because we can see on the screen the shape of what the sonar's picking up, and we could see the bow section of the Titanic. So we started moving towards it, and I'm looking out of my window, and all I can see is this grey material, and then all of a sudden this huge shape appeared coming out of the mud. And because I like to think of myself as not the dumbest person in the room, I said, well, I think that's the ship. So that was the actual side of the bow, just as and we were right on the ground level, if you like, and the ship was towering above us, what was left of the ship. And of course, a lot of the bow section is buried because when the ship broke in two on the surface, the bow section sort of planed down, and it would have picked up speed because of obviously it's designed to cut through the water. And when it did hit this soft mud on the ocean floor, it kind of buried itself into it. So the area of the ship, which was on the starboard side of the Titanic, so we actually came up on the port side. On the starboard side was what was damaged, and nobody has ever been able to see the actual damage that was caused because it's all buried under this mud. So the bow is actually quite deeply buried. So entirely unlikely anyone will ever get down there to see that. So yeah, there was the ship. So I guess the things to say about that, I mean, obviously it was amazing being near the ship and having that experience. The other thing was that you may or may not be aware that the ship is gradually deteriorating. So at that stage, so in 2001, the ship had sunk in 1912. So 2001, obviously we're now looking at 87 years later. So a good deal of time had passed, and what had happened was all of the wood had gone. So when we were because we kind of drove around and went sort of up the side of the bow, we got to the front where the I'm the King of the World stuff all happened in the movie. We saw that. We went over the decks, but the wood that was in the decks is long gone. That's all deteriorated away. It's probably been eaten because there are a lot of microscopic animals down there. There are actually fish. Saw some fish down there that I think are called soldier fish, but they're quite unusual. They've got very tall tails. The upper part of their tail is quite large. And I was in Perth Museum in Australia a few months later, because that was where I was living at the time that I did the dive. And I just saw these fossil fish that they found, which looked very, very similar to my untrained eye, let's say, to what I'd seen down around the wreck. So there are fish. There are you see the occasional crab down there. There are sponges down there. So there's a lot of animal life down there. But the key thing is that the bacteria. So there are bacteria down there, and bear in mind it's very cold. So it's around 3 degrees. So that was our external temperature, 3 degrees Celsius, and this bacteria is gradually eating the iron in the ship. So, and as that happens, then the weight of the superstructure, as what's underneath it gets eaten, will gradually collapse. So I guess I see different estimates for how long the ship will be recognizable. Maybe there's another 25 years left, but it's that sort of order. So it's definitely more than halfway through that period of being eaten, I guess, to a point where it will just collapse on itself and will be just a pile of wreckage that's just barely recognizable as having once been this amazing ship. So you get and what this bacteria does, it leaves behind rust, basically iron oxide, but the way it excretes it looks like they are it's like icicles on the side of the ship, but made in orange. So they're referred to as rusticles. And we did actually knock one or two of them. And what happens there is that you are instantly engulfed in this orange cloud and you can't see a thing. And we were Anatoly was having to back us off from the ship until we could get out of it and then kind of reacquire the bow section on the sonar, because this stuff would go a fair distance. and then we could kind of go back in and have another look. So the rustical aspect is certainly a big part of it. So what I'm going to do, I'm probably going to wind this up for now. So we'll refer to this as part one of visiting the Titanic. And in the next podcast, I'll share a bit more about what it was like to be down on the ocean, what it was like when we saw the second Mir, which launched half an hour after us, and we could hear the radio chatter, so we knew it had gone. And then what it was like to be recovered, and the sort of 20,000 leagues under the sea type experience of being recovered by the mothership. So on that note, I think I will leave it there, and I'll talk a bit more about the wildlife down there as well in the next part. So have a great time, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you again on the next podcast. Okay, have a great day. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.